How's our online world going there, David? Really? Come on, people. What's happening out there? I think I might be ready to introduce someone. Am I ready to introduce someone? Dean Fixsen. Dr. Dean Fixsen is about to come online all the way from the US any second. Should I just keep talking? I could talk about this man for hours. I know him. You need to ask him about his love of the plaid pant. Please. His love of the plaid pant. There he is. Hello there, Dr. Fixsen. Hi. It's very safe here, Dean. They're totally looking forward to hearing from you. I know you're going to do a wonderful job. May I introduce to you Dean Fixsen. Dean is a professor, a senior scientist at Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hall. He's wonderful. He's going to give us 20 minutes of just beautiful implementation science, which I gently introduced you to yesterday. Dean, I'm then going to help out the questions. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes, I can. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, we can.
Very good.
So over to you, sir. And then you'll see me in 20 minutes again.
Great. Thank you, Robin, very much. And thank you, Gabriel, for the invitation to attend the conference. And even though you are far, far away, it feels like at least I have a chance to participate in a modest way. And as you can see on the first slide here, the topic for this part of the program is about applied implementation science. And so we will speak about that. There's myself, Karen Blasey, Melissa Van Dyke, Allison Metz, and the four of us are the co-directors of the National Implementation Research Network that has focused on this for many years. So next slide, please. So everyone is familiar with the three things shown here. Diffusion, theories, dissemination is quite a popular topic. And implementation is the newest one of these three when it comes to developing a science. And implementation, just to be clear about this, includes diffusion and dissemination. So implementation is where many of these things start to come together. And so next slide, please. So the summaries of the literature, Greenhall and colleagues most recently identified three main categories of research and activity in the diffusion, dissemination, implementation field. And they summarize it under these labels of letting it happen, helping it happen, and making it happen. And so letting it happen is more the diffusion, networking, communication kinds of strategies. You're putting information out there. You're hoping that people do communicate and do make good use of this. Helping it happen is where there are manuals, there are websites, there are things that we as researchers, as policymakers do to actually encourage people to understand and make use of the science. The making it happen is the newest category. It's one that in some ways that we know the least about because it's newer conception. But it's also the one that we will spend the next 18 minutes talking about. But this is the purposeful use, active use of the best available evidence that we have with respect to implementation, practice, and science. So next slide, please. And in this slide, we're just contrasting briefly basic research and applied research. Since we're speaking here about applied research, we thought we should try to define that a bit. Basic research, everyone is familiar with, tends to be driven by the interests of investigators in many of the things that were just being discussed about multidisciplinary approaches. We're hoping that investigators are making good decisions about what to pay attention to and what to research. Basic research pays a lot of attention to internal validity. So we hear a lot there about the rigor of the research that is being done, randomized control trials kind of being the standard for much of that. With basic research, we hope that it is eventually useful. We're following our interests. We are doing very careful research, and in the hopes that eventually this will have application in real-life settings. Applied research, on the other hand, tends to be mission-driven. You're doing this research in order to help accomplish a purpose. You have a goal in mind. There's a social problem that you want to help change. There's a set of villages that you want to impact with new methods for getting clean water and what have you. So there's a mission, there's a goal, there's a particular impact that you have in mind. External validity is really the main focus here, which is relevance. Why are we doing this research? We're doing this research and we're collecting the best available data under these circumstances in order to help inform the solution to this mission. And it's immediately useful. Mission-driven research tends to be, the hypotheses are coming from the trying to do the work, and you're running into problems, and as you run into problems, you try to do the work differently, and as you get that research done, then it has immediate application to solving the problems. And in both cases, basic and applied research is contributing to the knowledge base and to the theory base. So applied research is really what we'll be speaking about here in the next few minutes. So next slide, please. And we won't spend much time on this, but just to let you know that implementation science and this applied, mission-driven portion of things, Fairweather, Saunders, Ternatsky back in the 1960s, and here's an article in 1974 where they were selecting random samples of hospitals and trying to get the Fairweather lodges for adult, this is for adult mental health patients. The lodges were kind of self-managed groups, very different from the typical mental health services for adults. But the thing here for implementation science is that these were purposeful approaches to encouraging the use of lodges in various random samples of hospitals. They tried dissemination of manuals followed with telephone consultation that produced very little impact. They found that face-to-face, what they called action consultation, plus the manuals, plus the rest of it, that is what actually produced people making good use of the Fairweather lodges. So some of the very earliest research on implementation as we know it today came out of these applied settings. Next slide, please. And in this slide you can see I just selected a sample of research. The first one starting in 1969, where Fairweather and colleagues really defined this evidence-based approach to dealing with people with severe mental health problems. But by the year 2000, they finally had a fidelity index. And by 2001, they had a clubhouse implementation plan, and this is for an international group. So here's 30 years worth of effort around the Fairweather lodges. These, how do you take it from the research that was done in 1969, continue to expand on that, and finally get it to the point where you can do lodges on purpose and successfully, and you have a fidelity assessment that tells you whether or not things are working well or not. So here's the persistent part of applied research. This is really a good example of that. Next slide, please. So we're slowly on the implementation science side. There's this accumulation of data over the last 40 or 50 years. There have been wonderful summaries of the literature on diffusion and dissemination, Greenhall et al. Being a nice example of that. Synthesis of the implementation evaluation literature that we did ourselves back in 2005. But the whole field is just kind of poised to have this evidence-based approach to implementation of evidence-based programs and practices. So finally, the goal that we have had in front of us now for many years, we are on the verge of having the chance to realize that. Next slide, please. So the data are helping us move from making lists of things. Here are the facilitators, here are the barriers, here's stuff from this particular discipline, here's some other things from another discipline. We've been making these lists now for the last several decades. The task in the last 10 years or so has been to develop frameworks to help make sense of all of the information that we have, and we think in a theoretical way to begin making predictions. So next slide, please. Excuse me. So here's a look at applied implementation, and here's a formula that we think really captures much of what needs to be understood. And you notice that with this is a multiplication problem, so all of these things are interactive. So we need effective innovations. We need the interventions that we have some faith in. If we do these things, we do them as intended, we will actually produce socially significant outcomes. But we also know that interventions don't implement themselves. So there needs to be effective implementation strategies. And none of those things are going to matter a lot in the long run unless we have enabling context. We have organizations, we have systems in which both the interventions and the implementation strategies are being carried out, but those systems are enabling, not hindering, the work that is there. So when we have effective interventions that are effectively implemented and we have enabling context, then we have socially significant outcomes that can be sustained and improved over the coming decades. So this is a fairly simple view, but it's breaking this down is what we want to do in the next few minutes. So next slide, please. So the applied implementation science, and here are the active implementation frameworks that go along with that. Usable interventions, implementation stages and drivers, improvement cycles, and implementation teams. And we're going to cover each of those quite briefly here in the next few minutes. So next slide, please. First, we want to talk about what. So what is it that we intend to do? What is this intervention that we think is going to produce the desired outcome? Next slide, please. And there are some usable intervention criteria. Now, we're all used to looking at the science. So how many randomized control trials does it take, done by how many different groups, with what degree of rigor? That defines the evidence behind an evidence-based program. What these usable intervention criteria define is the program. And it's the program that is going to be used again and again in social situations to produce the desired changes. It's nice to know about the rigor, but the rigor is not going to be implemented in practice. It's going to be the program. So the clear description of the program, knowing what the essential functions are, having operational definitions. What do you do? What do you say? When do you not do and say those things to have the impact? And a practical assessment of performance or fidelity. So how can we detect the presence and the strength of this intervention in practice? And we think that performance assessment needs to be highly related to the desired outcomes. We put in a correlation of 0.7, knowing that that's pretty ambitious. But it's one that if we have a correlation of 0.7, that's about 49% of the variance. So, but it turns out that maybe one evidence-based program in 20 might meet these criteria. So to the extent that they're not met, it's up to implementation scientists to find a way to encourage this to happen. Next slide, please. And just a couple of quick examples. Here's dialectical behavior therapy, low fidelity, 30% clean urinalyses, and high fidelity about 80%. It's the same evidence-based program, dialectical behavior therapy, done well with high fidelity or done poorly. So these criteria for usable interventions are very important. Next slide, please. Here's another example with functional family therapists. As you look down the left-hand side, these are the results for fidelity and outcome for each of 25 FFT therapists. Above the red line are the therapists who are above the fidelity criteria. There were 12 of them. They provided services to 204 families, 13% recidivism. The bottom half of this are the therapists who are below fidelity criteria, about the same number of families, and double the rate of recidivism, 28%. And you notice down the middle there it says control group, 22% recidivism. So it's very interesting to us from an implementation point of view that high fidelity produces very good outcomes. We want that 13% recidivism. But low fidelity is not necessarily a neutral event. Low fidelity therapists actually produced outcomes that were worse than the control group. So fidelity and knowing the relationship between fidelity on those usable intervention criteria, knowing the relationship between fidelity and outcome is a very important part of this. So next slide, please. We'll go to the middle part of this. Effective intervention, we need to know how are we going to put these things into practice, and equally important, who is going to do the work of implementation. Next slide, please. And this is where implementation stages, for example, exploration stage where you're finding out if this is something you want to do, installation stage where you're pulling together the resources, initial implementation. For those people who get to this point, this is pretty fragile. People are just now learning how to do the intervention. The context, the organization system context is not yet fully supporting it. The implementation supports are not fully there. So these things are very important stages, and ones that we don't want to skip over any of them. And as you notice out on the right-hand side, it takes typically 2 to 4 years. And the more recent data have come to confirm the time that it takes to do implementation well. The 2 to 4 years is from the time you first start thinking about this in the exploration stage to the point where you actually reach full implementation, where this is embedded in a system. Next slide, please. Then we go to implementation drivers. When you are trying to make use of an evidence-based program in an existing human service system, things don't go well. And so we need to have the drivers in place to help get the intervention there and to have the organization begin to support it. So leadership has to be very much in support of this. Have to have the competency drivers there. So innovations, interventions, evidence-based programs and practices, by definition, are new ways of work. So it is very important to have these competency drivers in place. Interestingly, though, you can have great leadership and the competency drivers in place, but unless the organization is changing, so the organization is there to help support this, sustainability is a real problem. So on the next slide, please, you can see when you have the organization leadership drivers in place, these 219 attempts, 84% of them lasted 6 years or longer. Without that, if you're just focusing on the practitioners and developing the competency of practitioners, 17%. Next slide, please. Improvement cycles. This really gets into improvement science and many of the other things that you, I think, will hear about during the course of the conference. Suffice it to say here that there are rapid cycle, plan, do, study, act problem-solving approaches that have been around for many, many years and used in many contexts in human services and beyond. Usability testing is borrowed from our colleagues in computer science. It's a way of doing pilot testing where you're detecting, correcting errors very, very rapidly. And policy practice, or practice to policy communication loop. In the next minute and a half, we're going to get to that just to show it to you quickly. Next slide, please. Implementation team. Who does the work? An implementation team needs to be embedded in the organization. These are people like information technology folks who really understand hardware and software for computers. These are the people who really understand innovations and implementation and organization change. Much of our work here at the National Implementation Research Network is the development of these implementation teams. Next slide, please. And for each of these things that we're talking about, there are ways to assess them in practice. And as you notice, from time 1 to time 2 to time 3, the composite score in the red circles at the bottom changed from 1.1 and then increased, and this is on a 0, 1, 2 scale, so 2 is the best you could hope for. But as the implementation team did better with the implementation drivers, then we had better outcomes for fidelity. Next slide, please. And not only that, but when we have an implementation team that has this expertise and they're working with an evidence-based program, you get about 80% success in about 3 years. And without that, there's more data now that says you get about 14% success in 17 years. So it is, here's a choice that we can make as a field. If we invest in implementation teams, we are much more likely to get those socially desirable outcomes. Next slide, please, and we are almost there. I just want to give you a flavor. So enabling context we want to take up. So where will all of this work be going on with interventions and implementation? Next slide, please. And this is a little complex, but this is where so many things come together. This is where executive management teams in organizations, systems, whole countries are deciding that they want to have evidence-based programs in use. The implementation team then helps practitioners make use of those interventions to benefit the intended folks. But that only gets you so far. The key thing that we have found when with successful change at a systems level is this practice to policy communication loop, where the events at the local level are being fed directly back to the management at the top and helping to change the policy. And out of that you get systems change. So next slide, please, and we're going to stop here. But a fundamental truth about all of this is that people cannot benefit from innovations they do not experience. So we can talk about evidence-based programs, we can have it in policy, we can have it in funding schemes, we can incentivize it, we can talk about it at conferences, but until we actually get this in place where those practitioners are making use of this on a day-to-day basis, the intended beneficiaries will not be able to benefit. So thank you very much. I ran over by 2 minutes, but we'll have time for a few questions here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well done, Dean. You and I have a similar cough, even though we have been apart for about 3 weeks. Can I check with David, are there questions online? Nothing. That online environment. All right, over here. So,
Ruth Curris from the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health. Thank you for your interesting lecture. My question relates to the implementation teams that you were talking about, when we've had a major change of government, there's, in the desire for governments to look different, there's a stopping of programs or new program orientation that happens. And I'm wondering, with your work that you've done in implementation teams, have you had examples of where implementation teams have been able to survive a major change of government or new priority?
That's an excellent question. Can any of this survive when we have those kind of major changes? So what we're learning, especially in our work right now in education, where a new administration comes in, you have a new superintendent of schools, they appoint new people, so everything at the top has changed. And so what we have learned is that we need to build in the implementation team structure within the bureaucracy itself. So that's part of that communication loop, and that systems change part that goes down the middle is to make sure that the people who are there from one administration to another they understand the importance of this and they support it. So just like when a new administration comes in to government now, no one comes in and says, you know, all of this financial accounting stuff we've been doing, that costs a lot of money. Let's do away with that. We have IT departments. We didn't have them 20 years ago. Let's get rid of them. We don't need them anymore. No one thinks about that at all. We need to have implementation capacity be in that same category. But we're going to have to earn it. We're going to have to demonstrate the value of this, just like the financial accounting and the IT folks have. Thank you.
Okay, so I've got one there.
Associate Professor Simon Ray Atkinson from the University of Sydney. More of an observation. I'm really concerned about evidence-based programs or evidence-based research. John Young yesterday was right to talk about research-based evidence. Our view is that evidence-based research and potentially programs becomes oxymoronic. Why bother? The other issue is the use of fidelity. Fidelity is an infotechno-socio term for removing noise from the system, whereas we look at it as agility as identifying noise, because the noise is potentially innovation for change and adaptation. So my concern is when you're using fidelity, rather than trying to identify why the laggards are not performing well and improving their productivity, you're using it essentially and very often used to punish. And finally, I'm delighted to see you introducing Ashby and the law of requisite variety, which we consider extremely important in the context of the work we're doing.
Yeah. It's only old people like me that remember Ashby back in the 1950s. So, but your point is a good one. But you notice on that list of criteria for usable interventions, there's only the one overlap really between the rigor side of things that says all the criteria for randomized control trials and the criteria that we have laid out, and that is at the fidelity level. If you have this program in place, is it actually producing the desired outcomes? And researchers need to help us out with that. Now, back to your main point, though, about identifying the outliers. And just as there are outliers that you are embarrassed about, there are also the outliers who are going to teach us the next thing we need to know. But without a fidelity assessment, we can't tell one from the other. And so it's never, ever used to punish. Everything in the implementation science part of this, on the applied side, shifts accountability to the next level up. We do not hold practitioners accountable for the fidelity data that they are generating. We're putting that back on the implementation triangle. Have we done our coaching well? Did we train them well? Maybe we selected the wrong people. Maybe we're not supporting them administratively in the way that we should. So it shifts accountability away from the practitioner, and practitioners then feel nothing but support in this, because it's up to us to figure out how to support them better to achieve higher levels of fidelity. And for those outliers on the positive side, it is up to us to learn what are they doing that is so good, that makes them so much better. That on the FFT graph, the number one practitioner had dealt with families and had zero recidivism in those kids. I'd like to know what the heck was she doing, that the rest of them weren't. So I think it's that kind of thing but without the data to indicate to us where people are, we can't discriminate which end of the continuum our outliers may be.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go for two more questions, Dean. We've got one online and one in the room. I can see with the lady with the red top. David.
Thank you. Simon Bronnett has written in a question about implementation teams. He says it's a great idea, and his question is, who should fund implementation teams? It seems unlikely that funding bodies will be keen to do this. Government thinks it should do and control implementation, so won't fund it. Industry might fund these teams, perhaps. This great idea potentially falls between cracks. How can we address this?
Well, what a good observation and what a good question, because but we just go back to the IT, the information technology. In the 1980s, we did not have information technology specialists in every department and every university and in every provider agency in human services. But now we do. But again, they had to earn their spot. So with implementation teams, compelling data for our colleagues in the policy and funding realm are that 80% in 3 years versus 14% in 17 years. And so once you start saying, here's what implementation teams can do for you to help you implement your policy and funding decisions, then they are more likely to come on board. But I think we're 5 years away from having some more standardized approach to funding implementation teams. Right now, they are repurposed positions in existing systems. Okay, terrific. Last question, Dean.
Dean, listen.
Oh, she's throwing her iPad around.
Sorry, guys. Firstly, I like the idea of implementation. I'm Liz Clark from Fenner School ANU again. I like the idea of the implementation science. In agriculture, we've struggled for a long time with a kind of a false differentiation between what is research and what we call extension, which is something we seem to have inherited from the land-grant universities in the US. I guess my question would be how you would differentiate that from what we call action research, but also I question the differentiation between basic research and applied research. My experience of that is that in applied research you end up with this kind of shyness or avoidance of theory, whereas to me I think that the theory and practice should be very much informing each other. So, yeah.
No, I'm totally with you on that, and tried to put at the bottom that that both basic and applied would feed into theory, inform theory, build on the knowledge base, and then take advantage of that. So far in implementation, some of the best data that we have come from people who are practicing implementation on a day-to-day basis. So people like yourself, you're there doing the work. You're faced with real problems, and this is where the mission-driven part of it comes in. So when we get into the finer points of evidence-based practice, practice-based evidence, is this action research? I mean, we think it's all of those things. And some of the distinctions that have been drawn when we actually are getting into a system, we're trying to figure out how to solve the problems that are being presented. I was glad to hear about wicked problems being brought up already in the conference, because we think that's our life, dealing with wicked problems. You get to resolve them, you get to re-solve them again and again and again. So I think some of the distinctions that people draw about the kinds of approaches to research and evaluation, we value all data, and of course, the better the data are, the more we value it, and the more we have designs, etc., the better. But for some things, you just want to know what's the best available evidence to help us make this next decision, because the decision is going to be made next month with or without information. So would we like to know a little bit or more, and you can always, save them up and say, well, a year from now we don't want to go through this again, and design something better.
All right. Dean, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thank
I know
you,
that would have
Robin.
been hard. And I'll see you again soon. They're going to clap for you.
All right. Well, I'm clapping for you.
I'll see you later. Apparently we just cut you off now. It's done. Okay. He's funny. Thanks so much for that. Just because Dean wouldn't have been able to comment, I'm going to use the fact that I'm up here to say something. I think the work that Dean talks about is actually extremely consistent with what John was talking about in the workshop yesterday, and in fact, I was really excited and impressed to see that. So I just want to make the loop there. And I'm happy to continue all of that conversation about fidelity and misunderstandings about it and concerns and worries and the issue, how it's different to compliance because it's not, and all that sort of stuff. And I also have the top 14 articles in implementation science you have to read before you die, which I send out to anyone that is interested at any point as a way to bridge the gap and sort of break down some misunderstandings. So happy to talk to anybody later.